All right, just to get started, we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 24 people. That's not nearly close to the full amount that we need. Let's just dilly-dally for a moment. How's everyone doing? How's life?
I think it's kind of ironic how you pointed out about the border crisis on Monday, and then like almost immediately after you pointed that out in class, Twitter blew up about it.
Yeah, I did. I mean, it's kind of hard to sort of look away from the images of people on horseback whipping black people. It's kind of, I mean, it is kind of evocative, and certainly, you know, makes for a very vivid image. So, see, I have prescience. I'm a prophet. Hobbes would call me a prophet. Why would you call me a prophet? We'll talk about that. Anything else happening in the world? How's everyone's journal entry going? It's pass fail, dude. It's not particularly.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the essay first.
Oh no, the essay I'm not even asked about. This is the journal essay.
Wait, so like we said pass fail for the journal entry, what does that mean?
If you meet the criteria for what I asked you to do, paragraph explaining the reading, paragraph connecting to something,
Okay.
you passed. You get credit for the assignment. Nothing too fancy. With the essay, it's a different story. With this thing, it's fairly straightforward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
21.
How did I say it here? 1, 2, 3.
Is that in here?
Okay, we're gonna get started. Okay. All right. So I have no bureaucratic announcements today. I have no recap to do because, in effect, we're starting something. I know I said some things about Hobbes last time, but I think I was trying to not get into talking a lot about Hobbes, so we'll start afresh today. So I want to start with a little story that is related to my experience of teaching Hobbes before, which has nothing to do with the actual content of Hobbes, in order to then sort of ask for a little shift in how we do this class. And then I will sort of get into the actual mechanics of what Hobbes is about. But before we do any of that, I'll tell you why I assigned it. How many of you read it for today? You should have all read it because the journal entries due for today. Is that Hobbes? Okay, everybody read it. What do you guys think of it? Mercedes?
I mean, it's incredibly different from any of the other political theory texts that I've read for this or my political theory class because it's the first one that really sets it up in a way that's not based in beliefs or personal ideology, and it sets it up in something similar to the scientific method, in which it's stating facts that are somewhat divorced from religion.
Absolutely. I mean, he's very. We'll talk about this a little bit. He's very much part of the Newtonian world. And I think I mentioned this last time, but I'll say it again. He went to Europe and he met Galileo. Like he's part of that moment in time when the sort of sciences are rising up and they tend to bring their insights into politics, but independent. So it's not politics that informs what science can do, but science can inform what politics can do. That becomes part of sort of this wave that Hobbes is part of. Certainly, you absolutely caught that. Anything else? Anybody else like it? Nick?
I think he's very pessimistic about the human nature. So.
Pessimistic. Okay. All right. Or realistic.
Yeah, you could say that.
Realistic. All right. So Mina Sang says, I tried my best to read through it, but it was really hard for it to keep my attention. I felt I wasn't retaining any of what I read. That's fine, Mina. Kudos to you for trying to read it. It's it is one of the joys of my life to assign texts that are very hard to read and watch people struggle through them. No, jokes apart. Thank you for trying. Thank you for trying. And I understand. Did anybody else have the same experience? Just hard to read, can't keep your attention. Oh, I'm sorry. If it was Katniss Everdeen, then you would have read it? Yes. I know, Mario. I know you would have read it. Okay. Mercedes?
I put it on an audiobook because they're all in the public domain, so.
Oh yeah, okay. There's that. Okay. How did they translate the words though? Like, because his spelling of words is like weird.
Yeah. I mean, I guess.
Was the translation okay? Did you catch anything like what? What word is
Yeah,
that?
yeah, there are lots of words that nobody really, like, you can tell what they mean by context, but it's like you can tell that they're antiquated words and stuff.
Sure. Okay. So why do I make you read this? Well, there are two reasons for why we read Hobbes, and I'm going to talk about that. But I'll also tell you about why, overall, within the context of a course devoted to comparative political theory, did I make you read this book, or the parts of the book that I've asked you to read. Let me start with that. So the next thing we're going to read after this is Buddhist political thought. And what I wanted you to focus on, and what we're going to try and focus on today, is we'll tell the Hobbesian story very briefly, what it is. People can write and do write entire books on Hobbes, some chapters of Hobbes. But we're not interested in that. What I'm really interested in is the kind of things he puts into human beings as the starting assumptions for what human beings are like. And the kind of politics that then he thinks emerges inescapably from that. I want us to sort of think about that and feel its weight, because the argument that I want to make, and I may not do a good job of making it. Other people might do a better job of it, and I'll say more about this in a moment. But it's almost incontrovertibly the fact that if not at the level of domestic politics, though there too, but certainly at the level of international politics, we live in a Hobbesian world. The things that he has put into his assumptions about what human beings are like describe to a very great degree the world. And so, if you're doing comparative political thought as a way of thinking about other ways of understanding our world, then we could look at our I did not mute myself. Thank you very much. I did not mute myself. Did you mute me? No, I don't know. I didn't even touch it. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know which part you guys did not hear. Let me try again. Apologies to everybody in the room, but give me a chance for me to say it all over again. Okay. So my job is to explain to you what the Hobbesian world that we live in today is. And I would suggest to you, even if I don't do a good job of convincing you, that we in fact do live in a fairly Hobbesian world, or a world that is built on the same kinds of elements of psychology that Hobbes so presciently identifies. And this world, if not at the domestic level, although there are two in places, certainly exists at the international level. But what I want to do more than that is next week when we do Buddhist political thought, I want to contrast elements of the Hobbesian psychology, the Newtonian psychology that Hobbes so eloquently describes. And so in some ways it's very funny actually what he does with it. I want to bring that into conversation with Buddhist political thought. How do the Buddhists imagine the self? Because the argument that I will show you right now, the Hobbes-Hobbesian method that Mercedes so correctly identified, is it takes elements, basic elements of what human beings are, of how human beings interact with the world, and shows how through a series of unavoidable limitations they have, they end up in a situation that is incredibly destructive to their own well-being, until finally they realize the need for a sovereign state that will protect them from their own unavoidable limitations. But what if we were to put a different version of human nature at the start of the story? What if we were to derive something with a different set of assumptions? What would that look like? What kind of world would we may end up with there? So that's the project that I wanted us to engage in for the next couple of weeks. Today, my job is to sort of try and explain to you what the Hobbesian story is, and I want to talk to you about what you think about how convincing the story is. And I would suggest to you that you can't simply blow it off and say it's not convincing at all. It's very convincing insofar as a lot of people have built entire worldviews that, when asked to justify it, say, well, Hobbes was right. So anyway, so that's the reason why I was assigned this book. Let me say a little bit about my experience of teaching it, just to lighten the mood a little bit. It's on the Anyway, I'm traumatized from teaching about Hobbes. It has nothing to do with Hobbes. So when I was a grad student at UF, my department nominated, I was very proud of this, my department nominated me for a university-wide teaching award. I was very excited. And the way this award was given was, on some random day, a person would show up from some other department, some professor from some other department, and they would evaluate, they would sit in the back and they would evaluate your teaching. And 2 such people were supposed to show up over the course of the semester. So the very first day someone shows up, I'm teaching the first day of teaching Hobbes. And the person is sitting in the back, and I'm like, yeah, awesome. So somehow everything just clicks. Like, Andrew and John went at it, like it was perfect. Like everybody was going at it super, super seriously. And even the professor got excited at the back. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to win this award. This is going to be great. So let's say it was a Monday. On Wednesday, it wasn't supposed to be consecutively, but some other showed up. And this guy was from the engineering department. And for whatever reason that day, my class looked like this. Like most people weren't in person. Like most people were absent. And the guy sitting in the back literally fell asleep in the middle of class. And there was no energy in the room. And I was like, that's it. This is Hobbes' fault. I take no responsibility for this. I did not win the award because the guy probably thought I was very boring. So hopefully I will not have that experience today. But I've not taught Hobbes in a long time. So I want to get you guys involved. I want to get you talking about what you think Hobbes is saying and what his implications are. But I'll set it up for you in a way that makes it helpful for all of us. People online, please do feel free to participate. We need your presence here. Okay, so let me remind you again of Hobbes' context. I mentioned this very briefly. So Hobbes is writing at the end of the English Civil War, or during the English Civil War, where the claims made by the people, ordinary people supposedly, on their own behalf, on the power that they have to contest the power of the king and his so-called divine right to rule, has thrown England into tumult. And civil wars are not, this is not like, Captain America going against Iron Man in a airport runway. Like civil wars are really, really destructive. They destroy people's lives, crops, children. People are killed. It's a horrific experience. It made no one live through a civil war. And Hobbes experiences this firsthand. And he is, by all accounts, considered to be, prior to these events, a defender or aligned with royalist interests. And then he publishes his book, The Leviathan, which seems to be making a whole bunch of arguments that are like really dangerous from a royalist perspective. But at the same time, he's not making an argument for freedom and liberty either. He's basically making enemies on all sides with the argument that he's making. And moreover, he's accused of the worst thing you could possibly be accused of in that time, which is, any guesses? Huh? Or what?
Being sacrilegious.
Exactly. Or being an atheist. And he denies all these claims. But it is undeniable to his readers at the time and for everybody afterwards that something amazing has been created, something that needs to be dealt with. And what that thing is, basically, is an argument for supreme political power. Why people should not revolt. He's making an argument for that. Why people should not revolt. Why civil wars are bad. Why we may have to even bear the misrule of an inept tyrant to some degree. Why that is better than, saying, I want my freedom and I'm going to fight Braveheart style to achieve it. So Hobbes himself, as I mentioned to Mercedes, in response to Mercedes' question, is writing at a time when there is this tremendous intellectual ferment in Europe, and in his position, he comes from a very, very simple background. But he's very, very intelligent, very smart, very gifted in languages, and he becomes the tutor to, I think, the Earl of, was it Cavendish? I'm not sure. Doesn't matter. Some Earl's kids he ends up teaching, and because this Earl is pretty prominent and his children are going to be pretty prominent after him, he gets to travel with them to Europe, where he meets a whole bunch of political figures in Europe, and scientific figures like Galileo. He is also friends with a guy named Francis Bacon, to whom this phrase "knowledge is power" is often attributed. He's friends with him, and the story goes, this guy is incredibly gifted in languages, but he's not interested in mathematics. And one day he's sitting in his friend's house, and his friend has gone somewhere, and he sees on the coffee table in front of him what looks to be a mathematical proof. Right? So I don't know, like let's say it's not Pythagoras, but whatever. I think does anyone know how these proofs work? Do they still teach those in school?
Mhm.
Right? So they make a claim, I'm going to prove this, and then they go about deriving this theorem. And the derivation of the theorem is a very theoretical process. So he looks at this. It's okay. It's not this. This is not the theorem. Whatever the theorem is, he looks at it and he says, "There's no way that's possible. There's no way that c squared is equal to a squared plus b squared." And then he follows the logical steps of the theorem, the proof, and he's like left utterly aghast at how his initial sense of what could be right was completely disproven by scientific fact. And he says, or he thinks to himself, wow, if this was true of my attempt to understand a mathematical proof, which is a fairly self-contained, well, no matter how complex the proof, nevertheless a very self-contained sort of thing, imagine the ways in which I and everybody else around me interprets the political world, thinking it is one thing when in fact it's another. How our sense perception of what the world is like, which tells us how to guide ourselves to the world, is completely mistaken. And so what's needed for a new political science and political science to be active is a better understanding of how human beings fundamentally misunderstand the world. Or, I can barely see anything. I need corrective lenses. I need someone to diagnose my eye, to tell me what strength glasses I need. Similarly, we need to diagnose the ways in which people's political view is compromised, naturally compromised by virtue of a whole bunch of reasons that are related to the way human beings are constructed. And once we've done that, then we can develop a way to correct for it. Not correct for it by making human beings see better. He is pessimistic about human beings' abilities to change, or their eyesight, political eyesight or insight to improve, but the ways in which we can forestall the dangers that emerge from when human beings' vision is allowed to shape their actions. What do we need to do with politics so that people's lack of ability to understand the world correctly does not do more damage? The way we do that, Hobbes thinks, is by showing them how inevitably they are compromised as people capable of seeing and understanding politics on its own terms. And the way he does that is by developing a certain method. His is fundamentally a deductive way of thinking about politics. Let's start with some basic assumptions, he says, and let's follow the train of their implications. Let's try to minimize the number of starting assumptions we have. Let's have some basic ones. And one of his basic assumptions is that human beings are fundamentally flawed because theirs is an inability to understand how they, The first assumption is human beings fundamentally misunderstand what the world is like. They think that when they see something in the world, the characteristics they attribute to the thing exist in the thing itself. So, is this pen or the cap of this pen blue? Yes. No. Mercedes?
I mean, arguably color is based on perception, because if you were to change the lights to blue, it would look gray.
Exactly. So what he says, for example, he would say, sense, he says. And this is a very weird way of talking about it, but I want you to understand what he's doing there. He says, sense is nothing but the light from this thing hitting my eyes and activating certain cells within my eyes that allow me to see something. If I was colorblind, or if I could see in a certain spectrum that was different from the ones that you can see, and I would see something different. Sense is nothing but external objects exerting pressure on my eyes. Or the sense of sight, sense of taste, sense of smell, sense of touch, sense of hearing. We human beings are nothing but, and this is the part that I think if this entire class could be reduced to one thing, this class, not this whole class, but this section, it would be reduced to this. In the introduction, he has this line, he says, for what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels giving motion to the whole body, such as was intended by the artificer. Human beings are automata, kind of. We are operating as a machine. Our organs are machines. And like any machine, we are set off not only by the ways in which our wheels and springs and joints and stuff are constructed and connected, but like any automata, any machine that moves by itself, we are set off by the first cause. Identify that first cause that makes us move, and you will understand a whole bunch of things about what we will do once we've been set into motion. It's simplistic, I know, but it's actually really powerful. Its simplicity is its power. Because it allows them to develop a whole psychological picture based largely on some fundamental characteristics. So one of the things that he's trying to do, I know this is where it gets hard. I mean, I understand your concern, and everybody else is concerned, because you don't know how to make sense of this. But every author that you'll ever read is not only writing for you, he or she is also writing against somebody, especially in political theory or political science. And you have to know who these people are. And some of the people that Hobbes is writing against are people who are called the Aristotelians. They follow Aristotle. They follow teleology. You guys remember teleology? We talked about it in class. Long time ago, it was online in class. Teleology assumes that everything has an end. Everything reaches its natural end. It dissipates its energy or conserves its energy in order to reach. So, okay, so for example, why does the rock fall to the earth? Not gravity. It falls to the earth because it has certain motion that it wants to preserve. It's a very absurd way of looking at it. And then when it comes to the ground, it gets to rest in that sense. Hobbes says human beings, as finite creatures, experience tiredness. And so they assume that because they cannot go on forever, nothing in the world can go on forever. But, he says, we know from Newtonian physics that an object set in motion will remain perpetually in motion unless it has some other counteracting force stopping it. Human beings, like anything else in the world, once they've been set into motion, will follow that motion through and through until something comes along to stop them. He says, think about the way we experience things, the way we sense things. Like I give this example in a different context in my classes, but I'll share it here. Anyone play video games? That was way too quick. Way too quick. Anyone has ever played video games? Anyone has ever played video games a little too long than they should have? All right. So when you close your eyes after playing video games for a whole day, what do you see? Exactly. Right? Hobbes says that image just stays with you. No, he's not talking about video games, but he's talking about the sense perception stays with you. And it would stay with you, but for the fact that time comes and it corrodes that image. And what remains of it is a memory. And in this way, everything is working on you, upon you, and you are simply responding to it. Or, you know what, let me be more, we can go into the specifics of he said. I think he's actually quite funny sometimes. He's really funny. Hobbes believes that there is no such thing, or even if there is, it was set in motion by God, so it's a different thing. There's no such thing as free will. We are automaton. The thing that you think is a choice that you've made was simply the effect of some other force acting upon you and pushing you in a certain direction. And one of the great mistakes of past human thought, he says, is to come up with concepts and ideas that seem to us today to be so full of meaning and poignant, but are nothing but the attempt to avoid an unavoidable reality, which is that an object in motion stays in motion. Some part of you that wants something wants to sustain that something unless something else acts against it. Nick?
So, like, is his concept of like being no free will, is that why people mostly thought that he was an atheist? Because I know free will is like a big part of Christianity.
Well, I mean, that's one part of it, but I think also he could say, he's like, no, God set it into motion. God set everything into motion. So it's a different kind of theist. It might not be a Christian version, but it could be, but he I don't know whether he actually thought this, whether he was trying to avoid people from chopping his head off. He declared that he was a Christian and his philosophy is thoroughly consistent with Christianity. Spencer, then Mario.
Well, I was thinking about along the lines of predestination. And how like that type of Christian ideology that no matter what, like God had already like set your path.
Right. Yeah. So this is So the I think the Calvinists, for instance, but what are they called? Today the gospel of wealth. What is it? Oh God. There's some super churches down in Texas.
Evangelicals?
It's some version of evangelical prosperity gospel. Are you familiar with this? What's the prosperity gospel?
It's basically something where it's like these big kind of evangelical super churches say, God wants you to be wealthy, God wants the church to be wealthy, so give us a lot of money to the church. Your tithes are going to be like
right
straight to us.
Right. So the reason I mention that is because there's a version of Calvinism that says grace is predestined. Nothing you can do will actually deliver you, God's grace. It's already been written to, into the plan of your life. Well, how do you know if you are in fact saved or not? Well, if God has given you plenty in this life, he's given you wealth and riches and stuff like that, that means that he has shown you favor, and therefore you are already predestined to be saved, and therefore it becomes an impulse to then try and make more money, to give proof to what otherwise would turn out to be a lie, that you are damned to, eternal hell. But yeah, so the predestination idea can be consistent with some version of Christianity as well. Maria, then Mercedes. You had your hand up earlier?
Oh, no.
You did have your hand up. Okay. Mercedes?
I mean, I don't know how much, he actually put stock into believing this, but at least in the book, when he builds his argument block by block by block, and when he's building how humans work and their base psychology and everything, he starts with Adam from Adam and Eve, and he says that in this thing that he existed plainly, and said that there were no names or anything, so clearly they were built over time or whatever. So I don't know how much it's divorced from religion, because he he basically uses the concept of this is how humanity began as proof for his point. So I don't know how much he put that in as his own personal belief, or that's something that you need to include to be taken seriously, but that was at least included as proof of this is why we exist, because we began this way.
Right. So I mean, also people are, arguing to the audience or talking to a certain audience and sort of trying to start from where they are. And if they are starting from, as most people did at the time, from a religiously based sort of argument, then he has to acknowledge Adam and Eve as a starting point, even if he himself doesn't actually believe it. So certainly to perceptive readers of his, the implications of his, well, no matter what Hobbes may have said about himself, to perceptive readers, the implications of his thinking were radically anti-Christian and definitely atheistic. I don't know which is worse if you are someone in this time period. I did see your hand this time.
Because now I have it.
You did? Okay.
Not a question, but do you think that he would have written it, do you think he would have written it differently in a different time where there wasn't like a religious pressure to conform to a certain?
Probably.
Would it have changed like the fundamental things he's saying?
I'm not sure. It's hard for me to say. I'm from what I've read of Hobbes' biography, like he is the son of a clergyman. So there is that, but the clergyman abandoned him and his family when he was young. I don't know, that's a very simplistic psychological story. I think he believed that his stuff was Christian. So maybe he would have still written in a different way, but updated the vocabulary of Christianity to our times. But there are people who've written the Hobbesian story without any reference to Christ at all. So here's an example, that I like very much but I think he actually is very funny in a way, which I know it's hard to imagine someone writing in the style being funny, but the implications are funny. It's like people mislead themselves so much about what they believe that they come up with all sorts of names to justify their false belief. When their false belief is nothing but their own desire to maintain a certain way of life, a certain train of thought, a certain way of experiencing the world constant. For example, the word conscience. He says this is when people come to love their own opinions, they give it they give it a name. They call it it's my conscience. When it's nothing but a desire for power. Why power? And I've made a jump here, but I want to talk about it a little bit because it's important here. So if the Newtonian psychological story is a story that starts with the idea that we are nothing but automata that when set in motion are always acting in motion. The thing that we are most afraid of, according to Hobbes, the thing that terrifies us, is coming to an abrupt end. Because then motion stops altogether. We may accept being slowed down, we may accept being diverted from one path to another, but the thing that we hate the most is coming to a complete stop. Because we are nothing, it's in the nature of our very mechanism to want to maintain motion. Let me see if I can find a passage that will sort of, and maybe I won't be able to find a good passage that captures this. I can't find a good passage right now. It's not coming to me. Christopher? Yes, Christopher is asking, so he's totally upending Aristotle's telos there, right? Yes, he is. Yes, he is. Everything comes to an end, according to Aristotle. Coming to an end is the worst thing that can happen to someone. Although, Hobbes thinks that inevitably that's going to happen regardless. Let me tell you which. Sorry, yes, it was your hand. Yes, Spencer.
Well, I think about just like abrupt end, of course, I immediately thought death, right? But most people, I would say, they kind of want to grow old and then die, and is that just slowing down until you stop? Is that different than the abrupt end?
Right. So I think we need to jump ahead here for a second, and then we'll come back to this thing in answer to your question. But Kirtana, what's your question?
Oh, it was really quick. Did you say that the coming to the abrupt end, did you say that was Aristotle or Hobbes?
Hobbes. The thing we're afraid of is coming to an abrupt end is painful for us. Because what is an abrupt end? It's not slowing down and dying. That maybe you might accept. An abrupt end is being killed. It was going along happily, boom! Something about that fear of that activates something in us in a way that growing old and dying, becoming a character in the movie Up, does not. People online are laughing, I'm sure. Pinned up silence there. All right. Something about violent death really terrifies us. Why? So, in the Aristotelian world, and the way it was derived by or adapted into Christian thought, there is the idea of what's called the summum bonum, which is the idea of the greatest good. Take someone like Sir Thomas Aquinas, Christian thinker, writing in the late Middle Ages, and he develops the idea of the Christian summum bonum. In a Christian summum bonum, there is a hierarchy. There's God at the top, and then everything is organized perfectly in the world. Everyone is in this perfect station in relation to that perfect good. Everyone is trying to achieve by occupying their station in life that perfect good. Hobbes believed, okay, I'm sorry, okay, so let me just draw this thing. So here's God, here is the king, here are his priests, here are his barons, here are his merchants, and here are his serfs. Do you even have to draw this? I'm just illustrating this for your purposes here. And I don't think this is right. This is not the way the Aquidian summum bonum is not like that. When you are performing your role, you are contributing to the overall goodness of the world. Stability, being stationary, is the way through which you achieve goodness. Now, Hobbes believes that there is no such thing as a summum bonum. What we have instead is happiness. It's not perceived as stability. It's the constant progress of desire from one object to another. And you know this in your own lives, do you not? Imagine the tastiest food you ever had. Did you say to yourself, now, having tasted this tastiest food, if I never taste anything as tasty as this or more tasty than this, I'll be happy. Normal food would suffice. No. I mean, Taylor literally asked Spencer for fruit roll-ups online. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm kidding. It actually happened. I have the record for this. But we constantly want more things. Our desire, once activated, is never sated. It only becomes greater and greater. And so Hobbes believes that we are inevitably sort of keyed into seeking out more and more of our appetites. Because that's the way we are built. Our psychological disposition is such that once it's been set into motion in a certain path, it wants more of it. Now, Hobbes thinks that that would be okay were we, solitary individuals, or, it's okay when it comes to like trying new kinds of food, I suppose. But socially, that thing is not possible. Here's why. Because the fundamental reality is that if everybody is built in this way, if everybody seeks perpetual motion, and if perpetual motion is the fulfillment of desires, then it's going to happen inevitably that your desires at some point will run smack dab into somebody else's desires. What happens then? So this is, the idea of, in international relations captures this idea well. It describes the world as a series of billiard balls. Cool. Okay, so we get some balls. This ball hits this ball goes into this ball goes into that ball, this ball goes into here, this ball goes into a pocket in here. That's beautiful. That's summum bonum. But not really. For this ball, when it's hit with a cue, it is not like being hit with a cue. And it smacks into somebody else and changes somebody else's point of view, forces them to go in that direction, and on and on and on. It creates conflict. Why was this conflict created? Because somebody here, or maybe God holding the stick, cue stick, set into motion something at this point. This person, this billiard ball, thought, I want X. And it went out searching for X. It ran into someone who had X. And it took X from that person, or didn't, or was not able to. And then that person experienced something and did something to somebody else. Along the way, they all experienced new things and gave new meaning to their experiences. Language, by the way, Hobbes believes, is fundamentally flawed in the way it's been constructed. Because language has been made to mean different things. But all of language, this is really funny and insightful. All of language can be reduced to understanding different relationships to power. Because if what you want as a body in motion is to stay in motion, you want the things that will help you stay in motion. Once you've been set into motion, what you experience is not satisfaction and the lassitude that comes from it. What you experience instead is a restless desire for power after power. And that power after power leads inevitably to competition and contention for the means of power. And conflict arises because the way in which you define what your aims were runs into somebody else's definition of what their aims are. Because human beings are fundamentally unable to figure out, using our sense apparatus, what reality is. We all misunderstand reality. And two people's misunderstanding of reality, when it comes into conflict, creates conflict. Now, Hobbes says, imagine if this was what society was like. This is, I think it's the last chapter I gave you. Is that in chapter 11?
I think, yeah, you did.
Yeah. Right. So this is chapter 11. He says, felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. That the object of man's desire is not to enjoy once only, but for one instant of time, but to assure forever the way of his future desire. And therefore the voluntary actions and inclinations of all men tend not only to the procuring, but also to the assuring of a contented life, and differ only in this way, which ariseth partly from the diversity of passions in diverse men, and partly from the difference of the knowledge or opinion each one has of the causes which produce the effect desired. So Hobbes says, if you go and eat that tasty pizza, you like pizza, you want pizza, you love pizza. It's not enough for you to simply have pizza once and be happy forever. You will want to now make sure not only to get pizza again and again, but also to make sure that you can assure yourself a steady access to that pizza for the rest of your life. But other people, and you will justify it in all sorts of ways. You will say, oh, I love pizza. I love pizza more than anybody else does, so therefore I should own all the pizza joints in Tampa Bay. Or, I will make much better pizza than anybody else can. That's why I'm going to buy out all the pizza places in Tampa Bay. You can come up with all sorts of reasons. Those reasons are nothing more than your desire to make sure that you have the power to procure for yourself the means to getting pizza whatever you want. And somebody else will have the same sort of thing on their end. And when they have their reasons, which will sound to them to be perfectly reasonable, they will run smack dab into yours. And when that happens, when you are living in a world defined by scarcity, and that's an important part of the Hobbesian world, and I think it's realistic in that sense. If you're living in a world defined by scarcity, where there are finite resources, finite pizza places, finite whatever, when your desire for something cannot be diverted into something else, when you run smack dab, you will end up in a position of violence, inevitably. Let's step away for a second. Let me illustrate that by using a form of thinking that was very common at the time, which I'm sure you're familiar with in some fashion, even if you've never read Hobbes, and it's called the state of nature. So state of nature theorists, basically what they try to do is they try to start at a starting point. They say, imagine we were at the starting point of all society. Under what conditions would we end up in the world that we are in today? How would we end up there? Or what kind of world would emerge? And they put different kinds of assumptions into that state of nature. So Rousseau, for instance, anybody read Rousseau here? Jean-Jacques? So Rousseau's version of human nature, to the degree that he has one, is a very different one from Hobbes. In fact, he critiques Hobbes for misunderstanding human nature. But the Rousseauian human nature is human beings simply have the capacity, they don't have language, they have a healthy self-regard, they want to protect themselves from violence. They have pity, natural revulsion at the suffering of other beings, especially the more human-like they are, the more we feel naturally suffering towards them, suffering at their suffering. And C, we have the ability to become better, to learn and become more advanced. That's all he puts into the state of nature. Hobbes has put in a whole Newtonian psychology. He says, imagine if we lived in a world where there was no government. If there was no government, but human beings were the way they are, we would end up in a situation where basically there would be a constant struggle for scarce resources. It will not be enough for me to simply gather the food that I need and take it away with me and hang out quietly in my little cave and let the world fall to pieces. If I do that, and somebody finds out that I have saved resources for myself, they will come and get me and try and steal it from me. So in order to prevent that from happening, I must go and get more resources. I must go and get guns and tanks and missiles and all sorts of weaponry to defend myself. But when I do that, I run into somebody else. I raise their hackles. If I tell someone else, hey man, I'm not going to take your stuff away, I'm just interested in taking my stuff, and in order to defend it, I need all these weapons, someone else will be like, why am I believing this guy? This guy is only speaking from his own self-interest. He's saying all sorts of things to hoodwink me. I want to kill him. There's no peace possible. Now, at this point, when I taught my class back in the day, before there was, well, it was a simpler time, but also perhaps a more stupid time. But I showed that movie that I was referring to, Battle Royale. Okay, Spencer, when was the last time you saw Battle Royale?
I was far too young.
Anyone saw it recently after me mentioning it?
Not after you mention it, I've seen it recently though.
Okay, can you remember the scene from the not the Watchtower, the lighthouse?
Oh yeah.
Okay, it's okay. Maybe I'll try. If you remember any detail, tell me. All right, so the setup of Battle Royale is very similar to Mario's favorite book. You're put into a place where you're supposed to kill each other, and the last person surviving wins. And there is some rule about how they're they're all wearing these collars that'll explode unless they are constantly moving, so you can't stay in one place. But anyway, so these group of students, they're all from the same school, by the way. They same high school or something, the same cohort. This one group of people decides that they will not play this game. They refuse to be part of the system. They're not going to kill people just because someone is telling them to kill people. So they go off and they create in this little lighthouse a little mecca, a little utopian haven where everything is going to be fantastic. Into this place comes our hero, or the main protagonist of the story, who has been injured while the fighting was going on outside, because some girl who has a crush on him has saved him and brought him inside. At the beginning of the entire, when the first bell is sounded in the Hunger Games, when they immediately start shooting each other, in that first moment, he had, in acting in self-defense, he had accidentally caused the death of one boy, whose girlfriend is now in this room. And she, despite all her statements about how she's going to be part of this system that's killing everybody, she harbors a hatred towards him. So when they offer him soup, she secretly puts poison into his soup. And just as he's about to eat it, one of the other girls comes and takes a bite. And immediately starts choking and coughing up blood. And now everybody in this beautiful space, everybody loved each other. Everyone's like, what? Take out their guns. And they basically shoot each other to pieces. I can't show that kind of video in a classroom. I invite you to watch the movie. It's fantastic. What it shows so beautifully is that you think you don't want to play this game of power, of everywhere, everyone's searching for power after power. You are. You cannot get away from it. You will be destroyed by it. And sure, you may choose to be destroyed by it, in which case you're irrelevant. But to the degree that you try to protect yourself, you will only advance the game further. You will only make it happen even more. There's no getting out from it. And Hobbes says, if in the state of nature, where there is no authority, people live like this, it would be a condition of war of all against all. So he says on page 88, which is, I don't know if I asked you to read this one, chapter 13. I did, right? He says, hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war as is of every man against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known, and therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war, as it is in the nature of weather. What he's saying basically is that you don't have to be actually fighting to be living under conditions of war, where you do not know if the stuff that you have accumulated will not be taken by somebody else. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, which is worst of all, continual fear, and the danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Without government, to keep everybody in awe. Everybody's afraid of everybody else taking their stuff. And if you're always afraid of people taking away your stuff, you're not actually going to build stuff. You'll constantly only be interested in defending what the hell you have. And as a result, there is no industry, there is no museums, no movies, no culture, no commodious living, nothing. Life of man becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
I just kind of wanted to propose a more maybe like modern, if you would think that this would maybe lead to it. Would The Purge be a good like sort of cinematic application of Hobbes'
I haven't seen it.
sense of the state of nature?
I haven't seen it.
They remove laws and everybody just starts.
Yeah, so they literally,
Don't they form little bands of roving
I
killers?
mean, that's like the main characters of it, but like the sort of context behind it is that for 12 hours, there's no laws and there's no
Sure.
government.
Sure. No, and I think that there's much to be said. The only thing I would have conflict with is if the killers themselves ever band up in any way.
Well, okay, actually, yeah, okay, it's kind of end up finding out that essentially the main killers are the government, and it's basically the government is trying to kill, sort of
It's like rich people killing poor.
and yeah, they're trying to kill poor people to better the economy, and they're using the purge as an excuse to do it, but,
That kind of ruins it.
okay, yeah.
That ruins it for me. Sorry. No, I think Battle Royale is about the closest I've able. That scene in particular, that scene is really cool because what that scene, one second, Mercedes. What that scene does really well, I think, genuinely, is that the part of us that wants to deny this psychology and say, no, this is not true. We would never do this. We would be the opposite. We would be the people who would love and shelter. If there was no government, we would be like, wonderful people. In Battle Royale gives a dramatic illustration of one potential outcome of that world. Because even in that world, fear is not removed. And fear of violent death, fear of an abrupt end, Hobbes believes is such a powerful motivator that we cannot but avoid dealing with its consequences. And we've built entire political regimes. So Hobbes believes, Mercedes, I'll come to you in 1 second. Hobbes believes that in the state of nature, what has basically happened is that there is a standoff, which everyone's pointing guns at everybody else. And at some point you realize that you cannot possibly continue like this. And so everybody, and this is the part of Hobbes that's probably the fiction, or maybe an optimistic part of him, I don't know. Everybody decides to drop their guns at the same time and submit to a common power. And that common power is the sovereign. Hobbes does not care what the nature of that sovereign is. He doesn't care if it's democratic or it's monarchical. He thinks a monarchical sovereign power would be more efficient, but he doesn't care. But that there should be a sovereign power, and that sovereign power's writ should be total, is undeniable. There is no space outside of sovereignty, according to Hobbes. No space of safety anyway. But certain implications fall from this that I think are actually very cool, that Hobbes actually thinks this through. Hobbes says, look, the purpose of government is to provide you security. But if the government turns against you, a la the purge apparently, then you have every right to fight the government. You probably should. You'll be destroyed because you can't stand up to the power of the sovereign, but you should. But sovereign power has to be total, has to cover every aspect of life. So, implication. A bad implication, you might say. The Bill of Rights, if they come in the way of sovereign power, can be annulled. The writ of habeas corpus can be withdrawn, as it was during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln. The emancipator basically said you can be tried without a jury trial. You can be hanged on suspicion of being a rebel. Actually happened. Now we can say, in hindsight, hopefully, unless you're a segregationist or a secessionist, we can say, in hindsight, yeah, that was a tough measure, but I'm glad it was done. Something amazing happened as a result of it. Slavery was ended. Hobbes would say, sure, yeah, slavery ended, great. What really happened was the sovereign power of the United States was maintained. The benefit overall of having a sovereign power that is able to use its writ, use its authority to keep everybody in check, to prevent this fear that all of us have from becoming so overwhelming as to undo the bonds of government and society. It was much better that that government persisted in time, even if it meant violating the rights of individuals, specific individuals. The sovereignty becomes the defense against this fear of war of all against all. This place where man becomes poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Mercedes.
I don't necessarily disagree that people would be in conflict with each other, but largely he bases the assumption that humans exist in solitary from each other, which I would argue, especially if you study human history, or at least how, if you look at the archaeological record and you study the psychology of humans, you realize that inherently we're social creatures, but not only that, but there's never a time in your life that you exist alone, because the possibility of a human does not exist alone. You were born from someone, you were raised by someone, we die if we are on our own.
Sure, that's fine. I mean, I don't think Hobbes would disagree with that. What he's saying, though, is that the reason why he might argue that that was possible at all is because there was some kind of sovereign power to keep people in check. It may not be the same kind of sovereign power that we have today, but there had to be some element of consistency, of laws, of authority to police people if they strayed from the path for this to happen. Sorry, for human beings to be able to live in communities. Human beings on their own cannot live in communities. They need power to police them. There is no idyllic utopia or commune where human beings are able to survive without any kind of authority of some sort to control them. But I mean, Mercedes, I see your point, but I think he's also making an analytical point. He's saying, given what human beings are like, without authority, they would end up in a place of being solitary, nasty, poor, and short. And in a civil war, life would be very, very difficult. In Afghanistan, there's a story of a father of 7 children having to sell his daughter because he had to feed the other 6. You could say family life, family is very important. Human beings will stick close to what's there, their family, etc. This guy was being forced to sell his own daughter in the marketplace. So civil war does horrible things, makes people make horrible choices. And Hobbes is saying, we don't want that. We don't want to end up there. We need sovereign power. I saw some other hands up here.
I think he was first.
Sorry, sir?
So I have a question about the state nature.
Uh-huh.
When it comes to how sovereign powers act right now, they provide that authority that all people coalesce under. Have they all? Does a sovereign power just take? Doesn't it just take the Doesn't it just take over that conflict from the people? Because don't right now we live in a world of mutually assured destruction, right?
Sure. No, and international relations, I think, anyone taking IR courses here? International relations does a very good job of, I think they misunderstand Hobbes, but at least this part of Hobbes, I think they get a very good idea of. Right? In the Hobbesian world, in an anarchic world, there is nobody in charge. So you're basically responsible for your own protection. The thing that states hate the most, what they fear the most, what their version of violent death is losing sovereignty. States are primed to be jealously guarding of it. And so they spend a lot of money investing in armaments of various kinds. Now here's the interesting thing. There's a whole version of realism. It's called defensive realism versus offensive realism. Not that it's offensive. I think all realism is offensive. But yes, Andrew.
I don't really know a whole lot about foreign policy doctrine. So why do you think realism gets it wrong with regards to Hobbes? Because I've heard you mention that a couple of times now.
Well, no, because Hobbes thinks that once we realize what's happening, we will drop our weapons and we'll accede to a sovereign power. Whereas in the international realm, if yours is a Hobbesian story, then where is that world power to which everybody will agree? So Christopher asks, could the sovereign power be viewed as totally mitigating our fear of death above all else, and so in effect trumping our insatiable drives for pleasure that naturally come out of the national state or a state of war? It basically it tells us that our insatiable drives for pleasure are not the problem. The problem is when we fear that our insatiable desire for pleasure will not be satisfied because somebody else will use the resources that we have and the things we're willing to do in order to prevent that from happening. And what the role of the sovereign power is to act as a policeman and hit us on the head when we go too far. in following through the implications of our desire. But to Spencer's question, I mean, in the international realm, there's a whole branch of sort of stuff called offensive realism. And the offensive realists say, hey man, conflict is inevitable. What you must do when you're investing as a government, you must invest in offensive armaments, buy armaments that help you project your power. Invest in ICBMs, invest in aircraft carriers that will help you sort of reach the other part of the globe and attack someone there. Have foreign bases. The defensive realists say, no, if you do that, then everyone will be like, this person is building up all these armaments. Clearly, they mean to attack us. And so they will be amped up even further. And so your strategy will not actually work. You should instead invest in defensive armaments. You should have anti-missile technology and space lasers that'll blow up the ICBMs that are coming your way or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in IR that's trying to figure this stuff out. You guys heard about the deal that the US signed with Australia?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that was like.
Right? I mean, France is upset, whatever. But it's basically a response to China, right? The US sees China is building the largest navy in the world. And the fastest pace to the rest of the world. That's like, what does that mean? The Chinese say, hey, we're peaceful. We're not part of your wars of religion. We have a 4,000-year history that allows us to take the long view of things, which means that we will look at the world with very different eyes than your petty squabbles. We will build the Belt and Road Initiative that will bring the world together under Confucian values. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But from the perspective of the US and Australia, that's like, no, that's terrifying. Tomorrow, a Chinese warship will be in the Gulf of Mexico, policing trade routes through the Panama Canal or whatever, or something. I don't know. My geography of Central and South America is very poor. But you see the point. What the US is able to do today, act as a hegemon, I don't think it can sustain that position for very long without supplying and building the Quad, as it's called, China, India, Australia, and Japan. No, it's not. US, India, Japan, and Australia. But the idea there is, the sovereign power defends you from other people who will destroy you, who will take over your resources. China's ability to extend its military power the way it can do is a threat to the American way of life, not in the sense of like the Americans' sort of freedom, blah, 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 but the ability to get cheap goods and services that allow us to have a comfortable existence. So, I'm not saying whether the US is right or Australia is right or China is right, but you can see the implications of it internationally. Mario, you had your hand up in the belly.
I guess I just wanted to, it's not a question, but I feel like I don't understand why there's a separation between human nature and then the sovereign power, almost as if the sovereign power is not going to be made up of humans who are subject to human nature, if that makes sense. So I'm thinking of, I don't know why it came to my mind, but I'm thinking of the Truman administration and Hiroshima. So that was like, we're going to do a huge human rights violation to avoid war. I just think it puts too much power. They're human beings too, you know what I mean? So I think that it puts too much power, even if they're collective and we label them, this is the government, or this is the sovereign power, I think it puts too much power in people. I don't know what the solution to that is, but.
Sure, okay, I hear you. You want to respond to that, Tony?
No, you go ahead, and then I'll ask a question.
Yeah,
No, I think that's a really good point. Like, I understand that human nature is how Hobbes views it. But the more you centralize power under a sovereign power, the bigger the tragedy you can cause. Like, I don't think an individual could do something like the Holocaust or the Holodomor or Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
Sure.
So I feel like it's just extending it out to a larger sense of power, which can do way more damage to more people.
Right, okay, so I'm in anti-Hobbes sentiments here. Andrew, the Mercedes.
I agree with both your guys' point, but I guess from Hobbes' perspective, we were just talking about China, at least to kind of use a comparison from what's going on here to over there to kind of make the argument. The whole thing in American politics right now is there's this huge debt ceiling coming up, and there's the filibuster and all this stuff, and there's all these log jams in Congress and with the president and all that stuff. So the sovereign, at least domestically, you can make the argument, doesn't have enough power centrally to effectively do things. Whereas in comparison to, let's say, China, where they have all these, like centralized cadres and, very top-down government style, where they have this, elite that all agrees on a certain political project they want to do, at least from the Hobbesian standpoint, the sovereign has more centralized power, so they are able to act more effectively in the interests of their people and able to protect them more safely.
Right.
That's kind of the argument, I guess.
Well, also, and I want to sort of, in the way that, without, this is going to sound like I'm justifying the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm not. But from the perspective of that conflict, prior to that moment, or even prior to the firebombing of Japan, Japan was an imperial power. Japan was extending. Ask the Chinese what they feel about Japan. Ask the Koreans what they feel about Japan. Ask about a whole bunch of people in Southeast Asia what they felt about Japanese incursions at the time. So the Japanese at that point were fighting a war built on the same Hobbesian principles that the U.S. was. Today we say things like we were fighting for freedom and justice and the American way. No, it was a conflict of power at the international realm, and within that conflict, a realist would say, this is going to sound so bad because I'm saying it. The realist would say they lost. They lost badly, and we can decry it. But maybe what they need to find is a different way of organizing their power so they're able to defend their citizens.
I think that I understand like there's a world stage and every country for themselves. That makes sense. That's politics, yes. But the thing about the guns, and then we're all going to drop them and look for a power that's going, and we're going to put our fear and let them deal with it, and then that fear is alleviated now from the masses. We don't have to be fearful because we're going to put it in with the power. I don't think that's what's happening. I think that you have people who we label as sovereign power, sovereign government, but they're still people, and they make the wrong decisions, the morally wrong decisions most of the time. That sparks fear in the masses, you know what I mean? So they're not alleviating fear because I'm like, I'd be nervous.
Okay, all right. I think I have a response to that, but I will let Spencer respond to that. I think he wants to respond to it or add to it.
So from what I'm getting is like the Hobbesian end goal, right? Is not to have multiple sovereigns of different nations. It's to have a single sovereign of all of mankind, right? Where all of the one person who would police everybody's interactions would just be one person over everybody. Is what I'm.
But the person, but just to be clear, it's not
Not necessarily a person, but an entity.
Entity, yes, right.
And so that would prevent those this kind of war and these tragedies and things like that, or I guess tragedies would still happen, but people would even felt their fear, they wouldn't act on that fear unless they were directly being attacked by the thought, right? They'd lose.
Right. Yeah. So I think. I have a response, but I want to let Mercedes and then Nick respond to that.
I think that part of the fault of at least the Hobbes analysis of the human, part of the fault, at least if you're the scientific view that I find a lot of people when they analyze people purely through a scientific method, is that I feel like it misses important parts of itself, that it assumes things it divorces. It's like you're trying to study humanity with a divorced perspective of humanity, and it's like you can't separate government from humanity. So I feel like it's one of those things where it's like it's what he said, is that his perspective, you're limited by the fact that you yourself are human, and even though you're using a scientific instrument, you're struggling to, it's like you're refusing to admit. I don't necessarily think that he's wrong. I just think that his opinion is very limited, and that it would be unwise not to realize that. At least you have to realize that the perspective is very limited based on the fact that what we perceive is limited by the fact that all governments are ultimately made of people, and that governments, while they're entities and they have systems and structures, they will ultimately function based on what arguably is human nature or instinct, or it's still run by the fact that we can't separate those things from each other.
I was thinking that when Hobbes describes how like man's state in nature, he kind of specifically refers to man without a leader. So I'm thinking that his theory is even if the leader has those same flaws that man just naturally has, there will still kind of be some order, even if they're like a dictator or something. There'll still be some order because, you know, like when I read the readings, is he kind of like stresses on like fear, like using fear to like govern the people. So even if it's not like the best form of government, I
It's
think
better than no form of government.
it's better than no form of government is basically what he's trying to say.
Right, absolutely, and you know, and we're we're out of time, but I would say, and I will ask you to think about this. We'll talk more about Hobbes on Monday, and I'll also send you the reading for the next part. So we'll try and do both things together a little bit. We'll see how that goes. But the thing I'll ask you to think about is, sure, sovereign power can do horrible things and has done horrible things, but it has also been used to bring peace. The peace through the power of the sword. Right? I'll give you an example. So, if you listen to segregationists today in 2021 in the South, this is the story they'll say. We did not need the federal government in the 1950s and 60s to come down and desegregate schools. We would have naturally done it. The Southern mentality was naturally moving towards desegregation. And you were like, sure, absolutely, I'm sure it was. The reality was, it wasn't. It required the writ of the federal government sending down the National Guard at the pointed end of a bayonet to desegregate schools. So that was sovereign power.
But it was also, I'm sorry, it's also the same government that put in legislation to segregate, you know, so it's a reversal of sovereign power. Sovereign
Sure.
power imposes one power, messes up. And
I agree with you, Mark. You're absolutely right. But Hobbes would say you will never find a perfect government. You will never find a moral end that is utopian. Realistically speaking, this is what we are left with. A sovereign power is the one that allows us to survive best in this world, as Ariana said. We'll talk more about this. Excellent points. Okay, I'll see you guys on Monday. Have a nice week. Good luck with the papers. Look forward to reading them eventually. Adios.